So let's dive into the world of Power BI Desktop. For that, we need to download it first. To do so, we should go to the official Microsoft website here, powerbi.microsoft.com. And there, if you go to Products, click onto it, you can select Power BI Desktop. If you do so, you have two options to download now, download free and see download or language options. This one is fine, you can do this, but I recommend the advanced download option here, as it allows you to, well, select the language, and as it also provides some additional information we'll have a look at in a few seconds. So let's click onto see download or language options. Now this new window opens, and if we scroll down a bit here, we can first see that we can select the language Power BI Desktop should be installed and downloaded in. I'll go with English here. I recommend you to do the same at this point. And if we scroll down a bit further, you can also open this System Requirements menu. You see which requirements Power BI Desktop has. You see the required operating system. And down here, you see that you need a 32-bit or 64-bit Windows platform. If you're not sure here if you have a 32-bit or 64-bit platform, you can simply press the Windows key on your keyboard and then enter System Information. Then you can open this app here. And there, under the system type, you see that I have a 64-bit based PC. If you have 32-bit here, then you should go with the 32-bit version. And you can select the corresponding version now. If you go to download, there you have the two options. So 64-bit for me, this would be the 2-bit version. And now by clicking next, the download should start. You can see down here, it can take a few seconds. And once this download is finished, we'll continue with installation of Power BI Desktop. The download finished, so you should have this executable here. If you double click it, the installation wizard starts. So you can again select the language. We selected English already, so we'll stick to this one. Pressing next will bring us to the next menu. Here we can simply click onto next. We can accept the license agreement. This next once again. There you can now change the path where Power BI Desktop should be installed to. For me, the default one works totally fine, so I'll click next once again. And then we can start the installation. I'll create the desktop shortcut here. Maybe you do the same. So let's press install. Now this again takes a few seconds. Now the installation is done. And now we could launch Power BI Desktop immediately. I will untick this though and start it manually, as I want to give you one additional information at this point. So let's untick this and press finish. And now you have the Power BI Desktop application here on the desktop. If we now double click it, we open Power BI in a new project. Also have to save a new one. We'll do this later throughout this introduction video. Just keep in mind, if you open Power BI Desktop like this, a new event. What you can see here now is the starting screen, the starting menu. Don't get by this sign in part here. This is required for Power BI Service or Power BI this later throughout the course. For Power BI Desktop, no sign in is rare. We could directly connect Power BI Desktop to a source file. We go to get data right here, but I would like to go to the options menu first to show you one very important Power BI Desktop in general, but also to follow along this course conveniently. So let's close this pop-up here. And now we see the Power BI Desktop interface. So a lot of detail in the next module. For now, just go to File. Now to Options and Settings, right here. And now go Options. There. In this menu, please go down to Current File, down here, Additional Settings. This menu allows you to set the so-called locale. The locale is important to interpret numbers, dates, and time. So basically, make sure that if I apply a change to data formats, that this change automatically in your project. For your individual projects, you can use different locales. But of course, I highly recommend to use English United States right here, also the locale. So just make sure that this is set correctly. It's okay. And now we are back in Desktop. The problem we have, of course, is that we don't have any kind of data in home ribbon here, and go to get data. If you click part, you get a quick summary of some data sources. If you click it in right here, you get an overview of all sources. And as you can see, PowerBI with many of these covered throughout this course. You can also select, for example, file data sources like Excel, CSV, and so on, or databases like, or you can use this search option here, and then see we have this source type, and that's a source for this introduction project. Connect desktop to a specific website. What is our URL? Let's quickly get one. Here we search for the IMF World Economic Outlook database, April 2020. This is a database with GDP, so domestic product data for different countries and different years. And specifically the 2020 version turned out to be a great example for our first product. It calls this specific version to follow along conveniently. In my case, this is the first result right here, this one. So let's select this. If scroll down a bit here, select data by countries. Let's do so. Then we can scroll and select all countries right. Afterwards, we have to scroll down once again. Here we could select individual countries. Continue right here is the step. Then scrolling down once again, we can select the gross product type in cross option. And once again, continue. Now we can select the date range right one and find or in here. We now have our gross domestic product data for countries years. So if we scroll down a bit and scroll to the right to see all this data we have for, we could now download the report with this button. Alternatively, take the URL, so right click here and select here, and then take this to PowerBI desktop, right click and paste it here. Now directly access this data from PowerBI desktop. That's why it's called we can connect from PowerBI desktop. With this, let's press here. Here we can now specify, it might be the case that some credentials, so a username or a password is required. As we are talking about publicly available data, we can go with the anonymous connect. And now this component allows us to specifically select the parts of the website, and that we have to navigate default this table view, web view. The web view is a fancy one as it gives us, well, basically the website itself. We can select the different data, but the web view is a bit buggy from time to time. And then to select the corresponding data. Two tables, table 1, which we can click onto, and then go for data. And we have table 2, which we can also select, but here we see in the part that we have an additional column here with the estimates, so with a description of when the estimates are data. This is not what we need, therefore we'll go with table 1 here and tick this box next to the table name. Now with the data being selected, we can either load the data or formula. Now without diving too deep into PowerBI desktop at this stage, the difference here would mean that we get the data from the website and load this data directly into our so-called data model. That's the part where we can also create our visualizations later. Or can transform data, which would mean that we access the data and open the so-called query or Power Query editor first. In this editor, we can tailor our data. This means we can rename columns, format data, and so on. So prepare the data, then put this prepared information into this data model, and then build the visualizations. As I dive deeper into this throughout the course, generally, you typically start the transform data step, so with this step in the query editor. So let's do this here. And now PowerBI desktop totally changed its look. Well, it's not correct. If you here make the window a bit smaller, you see that we are now kind of inside PowerBI desktop. This first part here, this first window, is the data levels, which contain the data we will use to create the visuals later. This Power Query Editor is a separate tool which allows us to prepare this data before we load it. So keep that in mind. You're working in Power BI Desktop, but in two separate tools. However, when we load it, we can now start our work on this data to be able to create great visuals afterwards. We will not dive into all the details of the interface here at this stage of the course, but as you can see in the center of the screen, we have the data we received from the web. To the left, we can see this table 1. So this means we retrieve data from this table 1 we selected from this website. I want to get started with preparing our data immediately though. And if we talk about preparing data, you might see that the rows are not consistent at the moment. For example, this first row here, you can click into this row also if you want to see all the different so-called fields in that row and with the corresponding content. You see that here we have the country, the subject descriptor, and the unit and so on. But all the other rows contain the country name and then the corresponding GDP data. So you might say, well, this first row here is placed incorrectly. It should be our column names actually, because then it makes sense. Country, subject descriptor, units, scale, and so on. Now, Power BI have a great feature to do exactly that. So to turn this first row into the header. To do this, we select this home ribbon up here, which is already selected. And here in the right part in this transform area, we can select use first row as headers. If we do this, you see, what happened? We suddenly get rid of this first row, which now became the headers. By the way, the right part here, you can see all the steps applied to your data. For example, here, the connection to the source file, then the access to the table, and so on. And here we have this promoted headers part, which turned that first row into the header, and this change type was added automatically. It basically converted data into text. Nothing we have to dive too deep here at this stage. In case something accidentally went wrong in your case, you can always click the X next to the corresponding step to undo this step. So with the rows being finished, let's now look at the columns. We can select columns individually by clicking onto these or by navigating with the arrow keys on our keyboard. And if we do so, we see that our country is all right. Also the second one, we want to know what data we are talking about. But here, this third one with the units, I don't think we need this column, to be honest. To remove this column, we now have multiple options. One option would be to go to the home ribbon once again, and then here in manage columns to click onto remove column. Or alternatively, same option available if we right click onto the column and now press remove right here. Let's go with this option here. So column is removed. We can keep the scale here actually. But here, this country or series specific notes is also something we don't need. Therefore, we could again right click and remove this column. If we check all the remaining columns, this looks alright. Nothing we have to remove here. With this, we worked on our columns, but I think we have an inconsistency here. And this inconsistency refers to these columns back here with the year and then the corresponding GDP. Because if you look at the structure in the front here with the country name and then all the countries, well, I think it would be smarter to also have such a structure back here. What I mean by that is, wouldn't it be smarter to have two columns instead of all these different columns here for the years? One column could be named year with the corresponding year of the GDP of a specific country, and the second column could be named GDP with the corresponding GDP data. So this would make our data a lot more manageable, and the great thing is that Power BI Desktop comes with a default feature to do exactly that. So if we now select the 2014 column here, scroll to the right, press and hold the Shift key on the keyboard and select the 2020 column, we can now interact with all these columns, and I want to transform this data now. As I said, I want to turn these multiple columns into 2 columns only. For this, we go to the transform ribbon now, and here we go to the so-called unpivot columns feature. Unpivot columns will create so-called attribute value pairs based on this selected columns, and the attribute here would be our year and the value would be the GDP. Now this sounds a bit fancy, I guess, but if we click onto this option now, you see that kind of we only have 2 columns left now. What happened now is that we have this column here with the GDP year for the corresponding country, of course. And as you see, we of course now have more rows for the corresponding country because, well, each country has now a specific GDP value for each year. And we have the second column added, which is then the GDP data for this corresponding year. With this, we worked on the data structure, the rows and the columns in our project. And talking about columns, we should also rename these 2 columns because attribute value, well, doesn't add a lot of value here when it comes to understanding what is displayed here. So we can now simply double click here and then change the name to year, and also double click here onto value and change this to GDP and confirm this with enter. So we are almost done with our initial project work in the query editor. What we should do now though is we should work on our data formats, because at the moment all our columns and all the data these columns contain is formatted as text. You can see this by this symbol next to the column name. So this ABC here is something we see next to each of the columns. And if we click onto this, we see that ABC, well, stands for text. As we can see on here, we also have other options available. Before we change the data format though, we can close this menu with escape. So before we change that format though, we have to make sure that turning text into a number works. What I mean by that is if we have data in here, which might be text, for example, then converting this data from text to a number, well, will retrieve an error. An error is something we want to avoid here, as otherwise our data visualization won't work correctly. Before we have a closer look at the data though, let's first go to the left and let's see if any data format needs to be changed right here. Country, text, all right. Subject descriptor, text, all right. Same thing for scale. So it's only about the year and the GDP data. Both of these should be changed into numbers. Therefore, to make sure that these columns only contains data which can be formatted as numbers, we can open the so-called filter menu. The filter is available for each single column and can be opened by clicking on this arrow here. In here, we can now see all our data for the year column, and this looks all right. These are only numbers, so we can press cancel and close this filter. Now, in the GDP column, we should do the same. So let's select the filter. And if we now scroll down a bit here, let's see. Yeah, here we have an issue. We have NA in here. So invalid data, and this invalid data cannot be formatted as numbers. Therefore, we untick this box now. This means this data will now be excluded in our GDP column, and therefore it should only contain numbers, which therefore can be also formatted as numbers. By the way, don't get distracted by this list maybe incomplete warning here. It's not an issue for this project here. So let's press OK. And with that, we should be ready to go. So let's click onto the ABC symbol next to GDP and now change the data format from the text here to a decimal number maybe. And let's do the same thing for the year column here. So let's again press onto the symbol. And here we could go for a date, but as we only have a year and not a real specific date, a whole number is also fine here for our purposes. And as you see, the data format changed now, also indicated by the symbol 123 and 12 here next to the column name. With this, we are done with our data preparation in the query editor. Therefore, it's now time to bring this data into our data model, so into this other part of Power BI Desktop here. And to do that, we go on the Home ribbon, go to this Close and Apply button and click it in the lower part, and here select Close and Apply. With this, the data is loaded and this warning here is also gone in a few seconds. Yes, perfectly. And now we can continue with our work in this data model in the next lecture. We prepared the data and we now have the information stored in our data model, but we cannot see any data at this point. Why is this the case? Well, because we are in this. fields column in the right part here. So this indicates have sample in Power BI Desktop in our data model. For boost, we should switch to another view, the so-called data view, which is in this data view, you can now see again our prepared information. This is our final data set now loaded into the data model. We could apply calculations in here now. This will be covered later for us. Of course, I want to apply one change here at this point. This change is related to countries. At the moment, this country information is stored as text. Just tell Power BI that you have specific data here, specific data. So we have text, but actually this column contains countries. So geographic and the information that we have countries here, so the geographic information will become important in a few minutes. Now to tell Power BI Desktop that we have countries here, we select country column, and now we have these column tools here. In these column tools, we see the data type right here, so text. These are the same options we saw in the query editor. But here we have the data category. At the moment, we have uncategorized data. And you have plenty of options on how to provide additional information on the category for Power BI Desktop. In our case, the right category is country, but country down here. With that change applied, nothing changed here, but if you look into the right part, into these fields, which are, by the way, equal to the ones we saw in our report view here, you see we have this globe symbol in front of the country, indicating that Power BI Desktop is now aware of the fact that this is geographic information being applied. We can get back to our report view and now create visual. Create visuals in Power BI Desktop, you have the visualizations column here. And you can select this type directly in here. Let's to go with this one right here, the tag column. Just select it. And now you have this blue portion that any data in it, but you can center it as you want or even make it bigger. I think that's the right option in our case. And now you can center it like this. Like that. So we now portal, but we need some information in here. And for that, so again, this column to the right. Because now we have to interact between our visualization here and these fields containing data. And with the visualization, right, can interact between these two columns. This means if I want to get started with entering the GDP, I can simply select here and now drag and drop it into a specific of the. In our case, the good value that we want to display. Drop it. Now the GDP data is applied right here, but not very. We need some additional information to make this chart a bit more fancy. For that, we can now select the year and drag and drop it as the axis. Maybe we created our chart presenting for different years. What's missing though is the specific information. Like this, we just have it on a global level. We can go back to our fields and now take our country and drag it to legend. We have more details in our chart. Now we have the GDP for different countries. The problem is that we have a bit too much information. See a thing right here. You could click to right to see all the countries, but I don't think this adds any value. What we need right here at this stage maybe is a so-called filter to maybe only the countries, so the countries with the most contribution to the GDP. For them here. In this filter column, we can now say that we want to apply a specific visual right here. In our case, I want to filter for the top GDP. Therefore, the country is the important filter that we use right here. For that, we can hover to the country and now expand this menu. Then we can type. A basic filtering would allow us to individually select the countries. I want to select a 10 filter, therefore we select this menu and now go to top N. This one. Now we have to specify which top N should be presented. So N in our case countries. But the top 10 countries by what? Well, therefore we can again go to our fields column and add this data right there. Pressing apply filter now will, well, apply the filter and 10 countries here in our visualization. Again, we did a big change to our visual with just this simple step. We are almost done with our introduction project at this point, but we actually changed the data category of our countries. Remember the symbol we added a few minutes ago. So for country-specific data, world visual and immediately change this by simply selecting and now selecting the globe symbol right there. If we do so, we immediately get a world map in PowerBI Desktop with our top 10. The problem here is that we have the information for each single year in here. I just have GDP data for each country for all the years. Therefore, what we can do is select the legend. So we go to the legend area and click onto this X. With that, we now have the GDP data in a cumulative way, and the bigger GDP is bubble right here. What's missing here maybe is the country name. This will be our last addition to this visual, and to change specific visual effects, we can go to this menu here, the format menu. If you click onto this, you have how to interact with your visual, also covered throughout the course, of course, but at this point, the so-called data category. So if we switch this to on, you see now information regarding the country where the specific GDP belongs to. Also, add to that, we finished our first Power BI project, and you also saw lots of core features already in this little example. One last thing is missing though, and this is saving, because as I said in the beginning, if you open a new instance of Power BI Desktop, a new project will be. Let's save this current project by clicking onto the Save button in the left upper part of the screen. You can select a location. I will just save it on the desktop and call it initial project, and it will be stored as PBI Power BI Desktop project files. If you save this now, your project stored, you need it, and we can now continue with the next important part of this course. This out is packed with content, and I want to make sure that you know what you can expect.